Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 11 of Retro Unscripted. My name is Peter, and I thank you for joining me today. In 1999, September 9th to be exact, I spent more than $700 on a Sega Dreamcast, a variety of games, and a few accessories. It was one of the coolest days that I had experienced up to that point, because it was really the first time that I had gone completely all in on a console launch such as this. Prior console launches that I had been involved in, the Nintendo 64 for example, only had a couple of games available and didn't really have a lot of fanfare. As a matter of fact, I was able to walk into a Lechmere store and pick one up with no lines and no supply problems. Of course, with the Sony PlayStation and its launch in 1995, I did have a few issues with the system, but I only bought a few games because I really wasn't sure what else I was going to play other than Ridge Racer and NBA Jam Tournament Edition. But the Dreamcast was completely different. For years, I had been turned off on Sega after the failure of the Saturn and the debacle that was the 32X. After the Saturn failed and Sega kind of shrank off into the distance, I basically left them for dead. I look back on the Genesis with favor. After all, the NHL hockey games were fantastic, the Sonic games were fantastic, and there were a few Sega CD games that really stood out to me, but by and large, the system was in the past. And at this time, in 1999, I was primarily a PlayStation guy. I was playing a lot of games on my PlayStation, a few on my Nintendo 64, and I was generally content with what I had. But fairly early in 1999, a local video game store owner got his hands on an import Dreamcast and begged me to try it. I mean, literally begged me to try it. I was not at all interested. I put up some resistance because I really didn't want to bother with it. The Saturn was a flop, at least in my eyes. And the 32X had basically stolen $100 out of my pocket. The thing didn't work the first time I had it. And then my replacement, I only wound up having 2 games for it, which were disappointing enough where I wound up trading it in towards the PlayStation a few months later. But upon playing the Dreamcast and giving in to the owner's desire to get me to play, I realized that I might have been making a bit of a mistake. Sonic Adventure was glorious to behold, and the reason for that was because the visuals were so much more detailed than anything I had seen on a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 up to that point. The textures were sharp and detailed. The game moved fast, faster than anything I had really seen, and it felt next gen to me. It felt like it was brand new, like it was the future. So after playing the import Dreamcast at this video game store, I began to do my research and realized that there were going to be a lot of arcade ports. And you know me, anything that has to do with an arcade game or an arcade game conversion is going to be something that I'm going to be very interested in. And I was. Ports like NFL Blitz 2000, ports like NBA Showtime, ports like Hydro Thunder, House of the Dead, or House of the Dead 2, I should say, Virtua Tennis, Crazy Taxi, which you see behind me running on my PlayStation 2. These are all games that I wanted to have in my library because, as an arcade rat, my big dream was to have as many arcade games as possible to play at will. And the Dreamcast was giving me my best opportunity to do that. But not only were the arcade games great, but the original games for the system were great as well. Sonic Adventure was fantastic, for example. Zombie Revenge, although people tend to pick on it, is one of my guilty pleasures of all time. Metropolis Street Racer was a great mix between arcade and simulation racing with the Kudos system, which wound up being held over into the Project Gotham racing games for Xbox and Xbox 360 later. So it was really a great platform. I had a great time with it. I had a blast with it. I spent a ton of money. Repeat, a ton of money on Dreamcast stuff, extra VMUs, games when they came out right near release. I was just excited for everything Dreamcast. I thought this was going to be the next Genesis. This thing was going to give Sony a run for its money. Now, that might have been foolish because Sony was such a juggernaut at the time, and the PlayStation 2, which was waiting in the wings, was probably going to dominate, but I thought that the Dreamcast would still have its own niche and succeed, at least to some extent. Then you had a game like Shenmue, which was unlike anything I had ever seen before, so detailed. And I was guilty when playing that game of always going to the arcade and spending all of my money on Super Hang-On and other games in there. So I guess life imitates art there. I'm not very good with money in real life, and I'm not really good with money in Shenmue either. But that's neither here nor there. So life was good in late 1999 and early 2000. I had just recently been married, so life was good on that front. I was working for FuncoLand as a store manager, so things were good on that front. And throughout 2000, as I transitioned away from retail and worked in tech support, the Dreamcast was still really prominent. Then came January 31st of 2001. Just thinking back to this day still bothers me, and it's the day that Sega announced that they were discontinuing the Dreamcast and basically the dream was over. Now, they hadn't come completely public with it yet. There had been rumblings that this was going to happen. I distinctly remember reading about it on the GameSpot message boards and reacting very negatively, out of character for someone like myself who tried to really be even. And still to this day, I try to be very even and fair and not really lash out or get angry. But this particular day, I was really upset. So I knew what I was going to do at that point when Sega had pulled the plug. So the following day, which was February 1st, I started to gather up all of my Dreamcast stuff, my system, my games, my accessories. My wife looked at me the whole time. My wife at the time, I should say. Looked at me the whole time and was very curious as to what I was doing. And I said, "You'll see." I didn't even want to talk about it even with her. So I took 2 bags of stuff. I walked out of the house. I loaded it into my car. And I drove back to the same game store that I had bought or not that I had bought, but that I had played the Dreamcast, the import Dreamcast, at for the first time. So I walk in. It's early in the day. So there are no kids out of school yet, so it's basically just the owner behind the counter. And I put the 2 bags on the counter. Plop, plop. He says, "What's this?" And I said to him, "I'm trading all of this in, provided that you have a new PlayStation 2 in stock." If you remember, back in late 2000 and early 2001, PS2 supply was pretty limited, so I was kind of taking a chance that there was going to be a system here, and I got lucky. There was one left. So I said, okay, all of this stuff is going towards that. So he takes all of the games out. I must have had 30 or 40 games at that point. The system, 5 or 6 VMUs, 3 controllers, and I believe it was somewhere around $500 in store credit that he had given me at that time. So I said, that PlayStation 2 over there, I'm going to take that. I'm going to take an extra controller, and I pointed out some games to him that I'm going to show you here. I picked out NHL 2001, which is that guy right there. Sorry about the glare. SSX. What else? Madden 2001. And Swing Away Golf. So I picked out those 4 games plus Ridge Racer 5 and an extra memory card, and I said, total it up, and I'll pay you whatever the difference is, which wound up being about $35 or $40 or something like that. So, angry but excited, I took my new bags of stuff and I walked out of the store. But as I turned, the owner stopped me, and he looked at me quizzically and he said, "Why are you trading all of this stuff in now?" And I confessed. I told him the news that Sega was discontinuing the Dreamcast, and he was probably going to find out about it in a day or two, if not sooner. He nodded at me as if to say, "Well played." And I admitted to him. I said, we both got screwed on this. You got screwed here because you're probably not going to make as much money as you thought on all the stuff that I'm trading in, and all the money that I spent, ranging over $1,000 easily, is now pretty much worthless, or at least that's what I thought at the time. So I made my way back home, set up my PS2, and played my games, and that was pretty much it for at least a few months before Sega started making games for the GameCube and for the PS2, and I started to slowly but surely let them back into my life. Now, I look back on what I did then, some 13 years later, which is where we're at now, and I was probably a bit rash. Sega was struggling financially. They really didn't have much of a choice. It was in their best interest for their survival that they had to do this. But all the while, I'm still rather bitter. It was the last time that I had really gone all in, pushed all the chips in the middle, and said that this is going to be the system for me. I am sold. I want what you're selling to me. I will buy whatever you make. And it wasn't enough. The system only lasted 17 months before an announcement that it was going away, and then by 20 months, it was just discontinued, and retailers were selling off what was left of their stock. I remember how shocked I was at that time, and looking back on it now, I'm still a bit just stunned by it, because to me, it was really the system that I was looking for. It was where all the arcade ports were. It was home to some really creative games, to some really good games. And even though there weren't any EA Sports games on it, there were still very competent sports games from Visual Concepts, and the 2K Sports series were on there. So I am still a little bitter to this day, but I learned a valuable lesson, and something that I continue to follow to this day, and that is, don't go all in on console launches anymore. It's not worth it. It's better to wait to see what happens with a system before you commit money to it, or at the very least to wait for a price drop so that you don't get burned quite as badly. It doesn't always verify. Sometimes it does, like in the case of the 3DS, where I bought one thinking I was going to review games for it and wound up losing $80 on the deal within 6 months. But by and large, I had been better about buying systems after launch, waiting for initial reactions and not being burned as badly. Of course, now that I've gone totally retro and I'm avoiding the PS4 and the Xbox One, it's really irrelevant, but that's still a lesson that I carried for years after. So anyway, that is this episode of Retro Unscripted. Again, my name is Peter. I thank you for joining me today. And until the next time, I will see you on the next Retro Unscripted. Take care.